Did you know that there are still truancy laws here in the United States? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that issue. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, first segment of the year. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, to our viewers and listeners, with the hope that 2024 might have glimmers of more freedom than the last year had.
Well, I don't put it in terms of more freedom. I put it in terms of freedom or less enslavement.
Well, I'm so depressed about where we are that even a glimmer of light would be like the beam of the sun.
Well, I share your sentiments, and I got a feeling this is going to be a good year for freedom. But it's not reflected in what we're going to talk about today. I just came across a brand new article in the Washington Post that talks about something, Richard, that I haven't seen in a long time. I mean, you know, we talk about public schooling and the need to separate school and state, and that's the only real solution to the educational morass, which would entail the repeal of mandatory attendance laws, school taxes, school buildings, school teachers, public school teachers, administrators. In other words, the end of all state involvement in education and a totally free market educational system. We talk about that often. But a little known aspect of this, and especially with respect to compulsory attendance laws, are truancy laws. Now, I remember that phrase when I was growing up. You know, the last thing you wanted to be was a truant, and I would hear about truancy laws. But let me detail a little bit. I'm gonna read from my cell phone here this Washington Post article that's entitled, "Some Parents Are Prosecuted or Fined When Children Miss School." And they begin with a woman who has a 5-year-old who was in kindergarten. I didn't know kindergarten was mandatory, but it says the kindergartner racked up 14 absences in 5 or so months, half of them without explanation. The others had to deal with the fact that he had a fever, the mother had car problems, there was COVID in the family, and so forth. And well, the case was steered to the prosecutors, criminal prosecutors, and this occurred in a Missouri school district. The mother, Tamaray LaRue, was convicted of violating the state's compulsory attendance law, a verdict the state Supreme Court upheld several months ago. They sent her to jail for 15 days because of this kindergartner's truancy, her kid. And then the article goes on to say that that's not the only state that has these, that there's a lot of states that have these truancy laws. And it says more than 14.7 million students across the country were considered chronically absent in 2021 to 2022, 80% higher than before the pandemic. And that they're going after a lot of these parents with criminal prosecutions to punish them for violating the compulsory attendance laws. So, Richard, it really goes to show you in stark terms the reality of force behind state action and behind public schooling. You refuse to submit your child to this system, and they will send you to jail. And if you resist, say, I'm not going to jail, that's the most ridiculous charge in the world, they will take you physically into custody, and they will use whatever force they deem is necessary to overcome your force. For example, there was a guy named John Singer. I think he was back in the 50s or 60s. This was before homeschooling had come into existence, and he refused to send his kids to public schools. He just felt these were cesspools of indoctrination, and he wanted to homeschool. And they went out to serve him papers and prosecute him and all this stuff. And they called it resisting arrest, but they ultimately killed the guy. They just shot him dead. And that's the ultimate force behind this compulsory attendance laws. You refuse to submit your children to this system, and they will come after you. What do you think?
Well, I don't know if it's the same case that you were just mentioning, but I remember when I was a teenager, which would have been in the 60s, watching the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And that's the way it is. And Walter Cronkite did a story about a man in southern Utah who was not sending his children to school. He was a traditionalist Mormon. He had several wives, but he was homeschooling his kids, as I vaguely remember the story. And they wanted to arrest him for violating these attendance laws. Um, and he threatened if they came on his property, blah, blah, blah. So one day, as best as I recollect, he walked to the outer edge of his property, the gate where his mailbox was. Remember, that was a world of just snail mail, where his mailbox was. And they shot him dead.
That's
They
the case
said
I
that he
was.
resisted arrest. They claimed that he was armed. His wives said he wasn't. Uh, and the children were taken into state custody to be sent to state schools. I have no idea what happened to the children or the multiple wives and their relationship to their own children, but he was shot dead for no other reason than choosing and refusing to send his children to government mandated schools. I think what this demonstrates, of course, that's the most stark example when someone's life is extinguished in this manner. But I think that this shows the degree and the underlying belief and premise that the children that you have conceived and brought into the world and are attempting to care for and nurture are ultimately not yours. They are viewed as the property of the state. Now, this attitude, this belief, this policy has been around now for well over 200 years. The modern notion that the children are the property of the state emerged during the French Revolution, when the attitude was children should be educated by the state, that ultimately parents were the most permitted caretakers serving the state. And then with the rise of literacy in the late 18th and into the 19th century, originally done by private or religious avenues, the notion of the need for government mandated public schooling, so that with the emerging democratic spirit, how can you have an informed citizenry to intelligently and responsibly participate in the political affairs of their own nation through the voting process if they're not literate to follow the issues and subjects and policies and questions of their own time, and therefore vote in an informed manner? Um, so this is how this ideal emerged in the democratic nations, perversely, um, that students had to attend school for a certain minimum number of years, that the curriculum would be determined by the political agency in charge of the public schools, and that children would go through an indoctrination process of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but reading, writing, and arithmetic through a curriculum, a syllabus of literature in history, politics, science, philosophy, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, and that in fact, in the process of making young people literate, you would be doing so to have them have a mindset, an attitude, a belief, an understanding, an historical conscience that the political imposers wanted to have seen. And so, as part of this, these truancy laws emerged in the 19th century, that it was not only necessary and desirable and useful, but mandatory that your children go to these government funded, government run, government curriculum decided institutions of education. And that if you chose not to, you could be fined, you could be jailed, the children could be taken out of your custody. And in the extreme case of the gentleman you were referring to, which I may or may not have been the same one that I recall that evening news story that Walter Cronkite reported, they're willing to even take your life away to claim their right to mold the minds of your children. And that's the essence of what this is all about, tragically and in reality.
Yeah, it really is. And, you know, so many parents are now victims of this system and they don't even realize it. I mean, the whole idea of this system is to mold the mind of the child so that when the child, they have the child for, 12 years. And the idea is at the end of those 12 years, they have molded that child into being a deferential person who defers to the authority of the state, that trusts the state, that believes in the state. And it's a remarkably successful program. I mean, there's a reason why, totalitarian dictatorships have public schooling. Nazi Germany had public schooling, the Soviet Union, Russia today, Cuba today, North Korea. Every state official understands the power of being able to take a child and have him for what, 5 or 6 hours every day and mold his mind so that at the end of that process, he becomes a deferential. And unfortunately, so many parents today are deferentials because they're victims of this system and they don't realize it. And so what happens is that when a child decides he doesn't want to participate in this system, it's a boring system. It's a state-run system. It's like the postal service in terms of education. Um, the parent automatically defers to authority that says something's wrong with your child. And when they're hauled into the school and they say, look, your child is distracted, bored, he doesn't want to participate in the classroom activities, he falls asleep, the parent says, oh gosh, you're absolutely right, something's wrong with my child. A normal healthy child just doesn't do that. A normal healthy child loves this kind of regimented system of indoctrination. And so when they say, well, we really need to prescribe drugs for your child like Adderall or Ritalin or something, the parent all too often says, oh, you're absolutely right, we need to get my child's mind correct. Well, Richard, in actuality, the child is reacting in a very normal, healthy manner. He's reacting against this gross system of regimentation, indoctrination, mandates, compulsion. I mean, just think, the whole idea of education and compulsion is just abhorrent. It's the very notion that you have to compel people to be educated is just repugnant. And so what ends up happening is these healthy kids who instinctively know that this is a stinky system and are rebelling against it, they are forced back into the system, oftentimes drugged until they get their mind straight and they become one of them.
The other element of this is that there's, the widely expressed concern by a good number of people in the society, especially a lot of parents after COVID had their children at home being Zoomed, and they found out what their children either knew or did not know, or what they were learning. Uh, is that all this concern? My Johnny can't read. Johnny can't write. Johnny doesn't know math. Uh, this is all part of the monopolized indoctrination process of the current leftist progressive agenda. They don't want some people to do better than others in math or in science because that results in inequality. That means that some are unjustly lower than others. So better to have an egalitarian ignorance of all than for the socially unacceptable inequality of some showing their excelling at subjects, knowledge, abilities over others. This is part of this egalitarian ideology. And then once you set that aside, precisely to control people's minds, as they do in those other totalitarian societies, as you were just mentioning, you want these children to come out and say, oh, what identifies me? My gender, my race, my ethnicity. What defines human relationships? Conflict, the rich versus the poor, the oppressive whites versus all oppressed people of color, the colonizer and the colonized, the war of perpetual war of tribes and groups to gain control over the political apparatus to see that they benefit at the expense of those who should not. Now, this is an agenda and an ideology that is intentionally monopolized, just as it was monopolized for other purposes in the past. When you and I were growing up, uh, and those who are old enough, remember that when you learned American history, Christopher Columbus was talked about. He was that great explorer who had this misconception that traveling west would lead him to India, but he believed that the world was round, and he bumped into this new world of the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean islands of North America, and he helped lay the beginning of the settlement and the development of a new world. You're supposed, by golly, to be proud of this. And then as the history textbook continued, what would you see in the later chapters about America developing? Smokestacks with the billowing smoke representing industrial development and high standards of living and technological innovation. And by golly, it made you proud. And all began with Christopher Columbus. Now, those controllers of the state educational curriculum, those ideological monopolists, got changed over the decades. And now, what is the monopoly curriculum? Oh, Christopher Columbus was an evil man. He came to the Americas and spread disease and oppressed the indigenous peoples. And by opening this door to these exploitive white settlers over the centuries, all these indigenous people were destroyed and the earth was ravaged and the smoke is choking us to death and we'll all die because of global warming. Now, it isn't a matter in our context of this conversation, which of these stories is more believable, more true, more satisfying, more meaningful in some sense of how you view life and man and his society. It's the idea that regardless of the content of the message, the purpose of government monopoly education is to have the controlling vehicle to indoctrinate the youth of the country with the worldview, the ideology, the conception of society and man that you think all should have immersed in their head and be the way they think about themselves, others, and the state. You might have liked more the old one, where Christopher Columbus is a hero. You might like more the current one, when Christopher Columbus is this evil, dastardly being who would be better if he had never left Italy. But regardless of that issue, the important issue is that the idea that the purpose of public education is to have a monopoly vehicle to influence and inculcate and control and mind meld all in the society with the worldview that the political elite believes is useful, that happens to be the political elite that is in power over the government educational apparatus at the particular time.
Yeah, and those kind of issues inevitably, I mean, they necessarily become totally politicized.
Yes.
That the school board elections then become ideological battlegrounds.
Yes.
Where you're trying to get a school board member elected that adheres to your ideology.
Yes.
And this is all politics. I mean, this is not education. This is nasty, dirty politics. And if you can get your people, a majority of your people onto that school board or in the state legislature, because they're the ones that are there prescribing the textbooks for the students, then you're going to win. And the minority suffers, because if your position is Christopher Columbus, great man, and the other side wins, you lose. Your kid loses, and vice versa. While in a free market system, all of this is depoliticized. If there's a school that's teaching that Christopher Columbus was a great man, you can send your kids to that school. Or if the other way, you can send your kids to that school. You have all a range of choices. And this is what people fail to realize, is that what they're giving up is really the best possible education for their child in comparison to these institutions of indoctrination. Now, I'm not advocating necessarily homeschooling. Homeschooling is not for everyone. There's parents that say, we're just not competent, and they're not competent. But the thing about a free market is that you've got, countless entrepreneurs coming in, vying for everybody's business, saying, look, we have this package of educational materials for your kid. This is what we can do. We have these school teachers, or we have these tutors, and you can choose which is the best for you. You might have workplace schools where the employer brings in people to teach your kids, where you take your kids to school. It's impossible to predict what would happen in a free market. I think, but what we do know is that the free market produces the best of everything. And there's absolutely no reason to think that the free market would not produce the best education, the highest level of education, where kids are excited about learning. I mean, when you look at a kid from 0 to 5, Richard, he's like a sponge. He's absorbing everything, and he's bedeviling his parents with why. He wants to learn everything. He learns English, which is a very difficult language to learn. But by the time he graduates from high school, he hates learning, he hates reading. There's exceptions, of course. Now, let me give you an example of what I was talking about earlier. I had a school teacher friend somewhere in out west, North Dakota or something like that, South Dakota. And she said, I'd like to invite you to come and talk to my class about libertarianism. This was many years ago. And she says, I think you're going to find this very intriguing. So I go and visit her class, and it's a class of slow learners. And she's been assigned to deal with this class. There's about, I don't know, 10 to 15 kids in this class. And they were labeled slow learners. So I gave a 25-minute presentation on libertarian principles, including abolishing public schools. But the overall libertarian principle, the core principle, the non-aggression principle, legalized drugs, and so forth. Richard, these kids came alive. I mean, they just came alive, because here was a philosophy that reinforced their feelings about the reason they were labeled slow learners is that they were rebelling against this system. And that's why they were labeled that. But as they saw that there was this philosophy that reinforced their instincts and their feelings, they were as happy as they could be. And I think that's what's going on in this system, is that they're suppressing the kids that really want to learn. They're destroying them. I mean, well, I think they destroy everybody's mindset to a certain extent, or damage people's mindset to a certain extent with this regimentation. And let me follow this up also with the fact that, look, we're not talking about bad people in this system. I mean, my sister was a public school teacher. Her daughter, my niece, was a public school teacher. When I was first practicing law, my dad, he and I were law partners, we represented a school district. We represented the school board. Everybody is well intended in this thing. I mean, people are trying to do the right thing. The problem is that when you have a bad system and good people, that bad system is going to win out every single time. And I also should point out, you talked about how long the system's been going on. In most of the 19th century, there were no compulsory attendance laws. There were no systems of public schooling, and education was seen as a seeking process. In fact, I think the Latin root of educare or something is seeking. You're seeking knowledge. And if you, I remember several years ago, there was a special in the Civil War where they were reading the letters that soldiers were sending their back home, and these things were enormous. I mean, really literate, beautifully written letters by privates. People were literate. People were learning in this system, and the public school system started to come into existence. Well, they started in Massachusetts, and I think it was 1852. And then later in the rest of the country around the early part of the 20th century, ironically, at the same time that the other socialist vehicles were coming into popularity, Social Security, Medicare, and those ideas. Now, they weren't adopted till the 30s and the 60s, but public schooling was one of these socialist apparatuses that was coming in from Germany, German socialists. And it is a socialist institution, Richard. It's based on central planning. It's based on coercion, force, the state textbooks, the state's curriculum, the state teachers. So why would we be surprised when kids hate the system?
Yeah, the thing that you would bring up, this idea of, the battles within school boards, it's the very nature of the beast. Let's suppose that you want your child to do a Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the school day, while another parent does not, for whatever reason. Well, when both your children's are going to have to attend that compulsory school district, either your rule or the other person's rule gets in. Either everybody does the Pledge of Allegiance, even if the child or you, the parent, would prefer they not, or there is no Pledge of Allegiance, and you wish your kid did have such a Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of class. What about creationism versus evolution? What about these issues of what American history should be about? All of these become inescapable points of conflict, controversy, and battle, because either your people control the local school district and therefore have the dominating influence over the hiring and the curriculum, or the people who would like to be there instead of you have that control. That's the very nature of a monopolistic institution. The advantage of the free market, which again you were pointing out, is that it is democratic pluralism, unlike political democracy, where basically it's the majority that gets its will. Even if, like in the parliamentary system, it's a coalition of parties that have a majority, it's that coalition majority that imposes its will on the minority parties who do not have enough votes to be in control of the parliament. But it's basically majoritarian democracy, where the majority basically gets its way and the minority is stuck with it until they somehow or may not be able to influence opinion to move it into a majority in a future election. The democracy of the marketplace is pluralistic and diverse. Pluralistic and diverse because many people get their opinions. You go down the supermarket aisles with your shopping cart and you pick off the shelves the foods that you want to take home with you when you go through the cash register. And the person who's going down the aisles next to you, he's picking his stuff off the shelves, which may be different or of different amounts than you of these various things, and he takes home what he wants. The advantage is each one has a greater degree of satisfying their individual preferences as opposed to someone else's preferences being imposed upon them. And it's that diversity of a pluralistic democracy of the marketplace that makes it far superior to political democracy. And to use this jargon, it is not only diversity, but it is inclusive, right? Because everybody's preferences get represented and reflected. All that is necessary in the marketplace is that there be a sufficient number of desiring consumers who have a willingness for some goods and a minimum ability to pay for them to cover someone's cost of production to make it worthwhile for them to bring it to market for their wants and desires to be satisfied, regardless of what other minorities or majorities may want. That is the beauty of the market. You don't have to force others to conform them to what you want. Each can follow their own desires to a far greater pluralistic degree. And that's what makes the marketplace and its institutional avenues far, far superior to the lockstep rigidity of the political democracy that we have to live with over more and more corners and aspects of our lives.
Absolutely. And well, in our waning moments here, let's talk about an objection that we often get and have gotten over the 30 something years that we've been advocating the separation of school and state. And that is, what about the poor? Where would the poor go to school? How would the poor get educated? Well, if you look at the area of religion, I mean, imagine if we had state religion, Richard, with state religion boards and mandatory attendance laws that kids had to go to church every Sunday or every day or whatever. Imagine the battles there would be over which segment's going to get control over the religion board, like there are with school boards. I mean, they would be probably verging on violence. But we get rid of the state in terms of religion. We separate religion and the state. And interestingly enough, the poor have churches to go to. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody in any church across America checks people at the door to see if they've donated to the church. And you often hear this thing of, oh, the free rider problem. Oh, it would never work. I don't know of any wealthy person that donates to a church, or a middle class person donates to a church that says, I want to make sure that the poor are donating their fair share too. Nobody cares. This is something that they believe in, they will support, and it probably makes them feel good that they're helping the poor have a place to go. Well, we don't have that same faith with respect to education because we've all been born and raised under this state system. But there's no doubt that it would be the same, Richard. Educational vehicles would pop up for the poor. They would be funded by the middle class or the wealthy who have an interest in helping others, just like they do with churches or other charitable activity. Also, just in the general marketplace of things, if we look at the food market, grocery store market, obviously, the rich have better food. They can go to Whole Foods and get more expensive organic foods. The poor people cannot afford that. But yet there's a high quality of food at the lower levels, the lower price levels for the poor. Fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. You see that in automobiles too. Okay, the wealthy are driving Lexuses. The poor are driving a late model used car. But if you put these areas of food and automobile under the state control in order to equalize everybody, the people who would pay the biggest price are the poor because they're the ones that get the short end of the stick every single time. And you look at public schooling, the poor are the ones that pay the biggest price. They're herded into these cesspools in the inner cities of drugs, of indifference. There's virtually no learning. It's really a matter of survival in many of these inner city schools. So, especially for the poor, I would argue the free market is in their interest.
Yes, because if we look at where educational standards and excellence are lacking the most, it is often pointed out, and this is by left, right, and center, in minority communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities, where the people have become mandatorily dependent upon public schools, controlled by a government-recognized national teachers union, where those who are the teachers have no interest in demonstrating and devising excellence in curriculum and pedagogy, but have a strong interest in controlling the monopoly access to becoming a teacher and controlling their hours and their pay, as union monopolies always tend to do. In a free market, the schools would be competing. They would be competing for two things: parents and teachers. Teachers as one of the inputs, and parents to have the revenues that would come in to fund and keep afloat their educational school or institution. Now that means that two things: they're going to be interested in getting good teachers and evaluating teachers on the basis of education, experience, excellence, uh, 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 the pedagogy of the classroom. Can you interest students? Do you arouse their curiosity? Do you bore them? And the recognition that the content of the curriculum to bring in parents and students must reflect what parents and students would find interesting or useful for in general intellectual purposes, for acquiring the knowledge, skills, and experience that will give them a stepping stone when they go out in the world for their jobs and careers. All of this would be at work, which in a monopoly system like our public school system it atrophies. Nothing gets introduced other than the ideology and the interests of those who control the system. And this is why, to get back to where we started from, these truancy laws exist. How can we control what students learn, what parents accept, what we should have the monopoly control to impose on these minds, unless we can mandate that the students have to attend, the young people have to attend, and the parents will be penalized by financial fine or jail time or potentially having the children taken away by social services if they in any way infringe upon the standards we set of attendance on a regular basis so that we can be molding the minds of the next generation that we want to have influenced by our set of ideas and no one else's.
That's an excellent way to wrap up. But I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up one final point on this area. And that is that as libertarians, it's our job, Richard, to lead America to freedom. And the genuine principle of freedom with respect to education is the separation of school and state. And conservatives have turned it, have thrown in the towel. They've surrendered. They've accepted the notion of school vouchers, which is just a socialist reform vehicle. You're using the tax system to take money from one group of people and give it to another group of people. It's the same funding mechanism for public schooling. They now want to improve the public schools. They want to make them better, and they use these terms like choice and competition and free enterprise. And it's incumbent on us libertarians to reject all of these socialist reform vehicles, including vouchers, and to continue raising people's vision to the genuine principle of separation of school and state, because that's the only real principle of liberty when it comes to education.
Here, here.
All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Great to be back with y'all. Thank you very much for your end of year support. If you didn't quite make it, you can become one of our first donors for 2024. We'd be very appreciative. But in any event, it's great to be back with y'all, and a happy new year. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to another year of having them with you.
Until our next time.